Lil Wayne claimed the title of the best rapper alive, but offstage, he was barely surviving a massive addiction to lean, while the codeine syrup severely damaged his neurological system. His record label kept squeezing him for tours and albums. Instead of medical intervention, they pushed him to work until his body completely shut down, resulting in near-fatal seizures mid-flight. This is the unvarnished truth of how a hip-hop empire nearly worked its biggest star to death. The coordinates are the Holly Grove neighborhood of New Orleans, Louisiana, in the early 1990s. Holly Grove was an environment defined by severe economic deprivation, systemic violence, and a shockingly low statistical probability of biological survival for young males. Dwayne Carter was a highly intelligent, intensely observant, and fatherless child navigating this lethal perimeter. He possessed a raw, undeniable, and highly marketable linguistic processing speed. He could manipulate syllables and internal rhyme schemes with an organic brilliance that adults spent decades attempting to master. In a regulated ethical society, a 12-year-old with this level of cognitive ability is protected by strict child labor laws, shielded from adult stressors, and placed into advanced developmental programs. In the unregulated, fiercely capitalistic underworld of the Southern hip-hop industry, a talented 12-year-old is classified simply as untapped, high-yield proprietary hardware. The recording industry did not insert the initial fracture into his central nervous system. They merely monetized a pre-existing catastrophic psychological breach. We must examine the biological and environmental intersection that occurred in a Holly Grove apartment in 1994, when Carter was precisely 12 years old. The established media narrative for decades classified this event as a tragic childhood accident, a curious boy playing with an unsecured firearm. The clinical, corroborated reality, explicitly confirmed by Carter himself in his later years, is profoundly more disturbing. It was a deliberate, highly calculated attempt at biological termination. At 12 years old, Carter's primary guardian, his mother, discovered his increasing truancy and street-level affiliations. Her disciplinary response was absolute. She explicitly forbade him from continuing his pursuit of a rap career. To a civilian child, this is a standard parental sanction. To Dwayne Carter, operating in an environment of extreme economic deprivation, where his linguistic processing speed was his singular, viable escape vector, this mandate was perceived as a total erasure of his identity. His mother did not just ground him, she effectively terminated his operational utility. Faced with the sudden absolute void of his own future, the 12-year-old child located a 9mm handgun hidden within the residence. He did not act in a state of chaotic panic, operating with a chilling, methodical detachment. He dialed the emergency services dispatch, placed the receiver down on the table to ensure his body would be located, positioned the muzzle of the weapon directly against his own chest, and pulled the trigger. The ballistic trajectory of the 9mm hollow point round missed his heart by a fraction of an inch, tearing through his torso. He was saved by the immediate, unauthorized kinetic intervention of an off-duty police officer named Robert Hubler, known locally as Uncle Bob. Hubler breached the apartment, recognized the catastrophic blood loss, and refused to wait for an ambulance protocol, physically transporting the bleeding child to the trauma ward in the back of his own patrol vehicle. This specific historical incident is the Rosetta Stone of Dwayne Carter's entire psychological architecture. It proves that long before he was introduced to the chemical sedatives of codeine, and long before he was burdened by the multi-million-dollar expectations of Cash Money Records, he possessed a terrifying capacity for self-destruction when stripped of his perceived value. He was a biological entity who fundamentally believed that if he could not rap, he had absolutely no mathematical reason to exist. When the corporate executives acquired Carter shortly after his physical recovery from the gunshot wound, they were not acquiring a standard resilient child prodigy. They were acquiring a highly volatile, deeply traumatized asset who had already demonstrated a willingness to execute himself over the loss of a microphone. The syndicate did not need to psychologically break Dwayne Carter. They simply needed to hand the microphone back to a boy who had already pulled a trigger to prove how desperately he needed it. This provided the executives with absolute unyielding leverage. They knew that as long as they kept him in the recording booth, he would view them as his saviors, completely blind to the fact that they were simply locking him into a different, highly profitable type of survival. The acquisition of this hardware was executed by Brian Williams, universally known within the industry syndicate as Birdman, the co-founder and chief executive of Cash Money Records. The operational protocol Williams deployed to secure Carter was not a standard corporate contractual negotiation. It was a masterpiece of psychological grooming and localized manipulation. Birdman identified the gaping emotional void left by Carter's absent biological father and strategically positioned himself to fill it. He did not merely sign a minor to a recording contract. He initiated a complete psychological annexation. He legally adopted the child's career trajectory, branding him as a son, and establishing a profound, inescapable emotional dependency. To the young, vulnerable Carter, Birdman presented an immediate, highly lucrative extraction from the poverty and kinetic violence of Holly Grove. He replaced the threat of the streets with the glittering, heavily armed, and financially insulated perimeter of the Cash Money Syndicate. However, this surrogate paternal protection was entirely conditional and ruthlessly transactional. The emotional shelter provided to the 12-year-old was directly tethered to his mechanical audio output. Carter was instantly integrated into a corporate environment that violently normalized extreme adult behaviors. He was subjected to relentless, grueling studio hours that violated basic biological sleep requirements. He was surrounded by the physical presence of illegal firearms, the normalization of heavy narcotics, and the constant suffocating pressure of an industry that viewed him as a financial savior. He was entirely stripped of a standard developmental childhood and permanently bolted to a corporate assembly line. The psychological conditioning was absolute. His worth as a human being and his security within his new family was entirely dependent on his ability to generate hit records and untaxed liquid capital. As Carter biologically transitioned from a child mascot into the primary, driving revenue engine of Cash Money Records, the operational demands placed upon his central nervous system became mathematically impossible to sustain through natural, unmedicated means. The industry demanded a relentless flood of intellectual property. They required studio albums, endless promotional mixtapes, and continuous guest appearances to dominate the rapidly evolving digital market. The corporate executives required Carter to be a ubiquitous, omnipresent vocal force. To meet these staggering, inhumane production quotas, the asset's biology had to be chemically altered. This is the precise operational juncture where the promethazine and codeine cocktail transitioned from a localized street drug into a mandatory corporate utility. The pharmacology of lean is specifically designed to depress the central nervous system. Codeine is a heavily regulated opiate that blocks the brain's pain receptors, while promethazine is a potent antihistamine and neuroleptic that acts as a severe sedative. When consumed in the massive, highly concentrated, and unregulated quantities that Carter required, this liquid compound forcefully slows down electrical activity in the brain, suppresses the respiratory system, and artificially drastically lowers the heart rate. For the corporate machine, this chemical intervention was the perfect solution to human physical limitation. The heavy sedative effects of the syrup acted as a biological shock absorber for an over-revved engine. It artificially suppressed the immense crushing psychological trauma of his stolen childhood and the extreme pressure of carrying an entire multi-million-dollar corporate label on his narrow shoulders. The opiate numbed the severe physical exhaustion of endless touring schedules, the profound psychological isolation of extreme global fame, and the relentless grinding demand to constantly produce new audio hardware. The industry public relations apparatus and the global media actively conspired to reframe this severe chemical dependency as genius and work ethic. They lauded his ability to stay awake for days, marveling at the sheer volume of his output, entirely ignoring the fact that his hyper-focus was a chemically induced trauma response. Carter himself began to publicly rationalize his extreme reliance on the liquid narcotic. In heavily syndicated interviews, he claimed the syrup helped him create, stating that it slowed his racing, hyperactive mind down just enough to allow him to process his thoughts and record. In the clinical study of end-stage substance dependency, this is recognized as the ultimate, tragic, psychological defense mechanism. The biological host convinces himself that the parasitic chemical is a necessary symbiotic tool for survival and professional productivity. He fundamentally failed to recognize that he was no longer utilizing the tool and the corporate executives who happily ensured his cup was never empty had entirely overridden his biology. Carter was under the fatal delusion that the purple liquid was his muse, a magical elixir that granted him the stamina to maintain his status as the self-proclaimed best rapper alive. The chilling, objective truth was that the double cup was the exact mechanism of his enslavement. As long as Carter was heavily sedated, operating in a dissociative chemical fog, he remained compliant. As long as the liquid opiate kept him safely tethered to the microphone inside a dark recording booth, he would not question his parasitic financial contracts. He would not demand an audit of his missing royalties, and he would not pause to assess the catastrophic, irreversible damage being inflicted upon his internal organs. The executives occupying the climate-controlled boardrooms of Cash Money Records did not look at Dwayne Carter and see a young man slowly, systematically destroying his neurological pathways. They looked at the polystyrene cup and saw an incredibly efficient, highly optimized extraction protocol functioning exactly as designed. The physical architecture of the modern recording studio is intentionally designed to isolate the biological occupant from the external environment. There are no windows, no natural light, and no indicators of the passing of time. It is a sterile, soundproofed vacuum, engineered exclusively for the capture and refinement of audio data. For the vast majority of recording artists, this space functions as a temporary creative facility. For Dwayne Carter, the recording booth was not a facility. It was a permanent corporate enclosure. During the absolute peak of his commercial dominance in the mid to late 2000s, Carter did not simply visit the studio, he inhabited it. The corporate mythology propagated by Cash Money Records and eagerly amplified was said. The global music press framed this extreme isolation as the ultimate manifestation of artistic dedication. They branded his relentless localized confinement as an unparalleled work ethic. The narrative dictated that Lil Wayne was a hip-hop savant, a man so intensely consumed by his pure passion for the craft that he voluntarily sacrificed sleep, social interaction, and basic human experiences to deliver product to his consumer base. When subjected to rigorous scrutiny, this romanticized narrative of the tireless, passionate artist completely shatters. Human biology is not equipped to maintain a state of continuous, hyper-focused creative output without severe neurological degradation. The reality of Carter's recording schedule, tracking dozens of vocal performances in multi-day sleepless sessions, was a physiological impossibility under natural conditions. This was not the organic manifestation of a dedicated musician. It was the tragic reality of a young man trapped in a chemically induced loop of hyperproductivity. Carter wasn't just working hard for the love of the craft. He was functioning as a relentless assembly line for an industry that demanded infinite content, pushing his mind and body far beyond their natural limits. Hurricane Katrina did not merely destroy physical infrastructure, it initiated a profound, highly specific psychological crisis within the 22-year-old asset. The levees failed, and the kinetic violence of the Atlantic Ocean completely submerged the exact streets that had forged his linguistic identity. During the absolute apex of this localized apocalypse, Carter was geographically insulated. The corporate machine had securely relocated him to a climate-controlled, highly fortified luxury perimeter in Miami, Florida. From behind the impenetrable glass of a multi-million-dollar mansion, Carter was forced to watch live satellite feeds of his community drowning. He watched the federal government systematically abandon the very demigray, feces, that had manufactured his resilience. In the clinical study of trauma, this specific spatial and economic disparity triggers a devastating neurological condition known as absolute survivor's guilt. Carter possessed millions of dollars in liquid capital, yet he was entirely mathematically powerless to halt the physical erasure of his history. The neighborhoods he had relentlessly represented in his audio files were now underwater mass graves. The psychological dissonance was shattering. He was alive, wealthy, and safe solely because he had been acquired by a corporate syndicate, while the individuals he had left behind were stranded on rooftops surrounded by toxic floodwaters. When an individual is subjected to this magnitude of survivor's guilt, and they possess no healthy psychological coping mechanisms, they will inevitably weaponize their own trauma. Carter could not physically drain the floodwaters of New Orleans, so he initiated a violent, unprecedented auditory assault on the music industry. He channeled the agonizing impotence of Miami into the only environment where he possessed absolute dictatorial control, the recording booth. The immediate operational shift following Katrina was staggering. In 2006, Carter released the Dedication 2 mixtape. This project was not a standard corporate release governed by marketing executives or radio formatting. It was a visceral, highly aggressive, and completely unfiltered trauma response. For the first time in his operational history, Carter broke the commercial parameters of Southern hip-hop to explicitly attack the geopolitical structure of the United States, famously and directly indicting the president for the abandonment of his city. He utilized the mixtape circuit not as a promotional tool, but as a psychological weapon. He began systematically commandeering the instrumental tracks of rival artists, aggressively recording his own highly complex, superior vocal performances over them, and releasing them for free. It was an act of absolute industry hostility, driven by a man who had just watched his city die and decided that if he could not save his home, he would conquer the entire global rap ecosystem by sheer brute phonetic force. However, the tragedy of this specific trauma response is how rapidly it was intercepted and monetized by the syndicate. The executives at Cash Money Records did not view his manic, grief-stricken studio sessions as a cry for psychological help. They analyzed the data and realized that a traumatized, angry, geographically displaced Dwayne Carter was exponentially more profitable than a content one. They recognized that his survivor's guilt had successfully removed the final biological governor on his work ethic. He was no longer working to enrich the label. He was working to drown out the silence of an eradicated city. The industry cynically stepped back, provided the microphones, supplied the styrofoam cups to numb the residual pain, and allowed the ghost of New Orleans to fuel their most lucrative assembly line. The primary catalyst for this unnatural state of perpetual motion was the exact substance that was simultaneously destroying his internal organs. The promethazine and codeine syrup constantly ingested from the styrofoam cup created a highly specific, profoundly damaging dissociative fugue state. In standard medical applications, these chemicals are designed to suppress the central nervous system and induce sleep. However, when consumed in massive, continuous doses by an individual subjected to the extreme, high-pressure environment of a multi-million-dollar recording facility, the pharmacology reacts differently. The opiate numbed the severe physical pain of sleep deprivation, effectively severing the brain's ability to receive warning signals from the exhausted body. The body was screaming for rest, but the codeine intercepted the transmission. Simultaneously, the heavy sedative properties of the promethazine stripped away Cartier's cognitive filters. It lowered his inhibitions and created a trance-like state of continuous, unfiltered verbal output. He was famously known for never physically writing down his lyrics. He would simply step up to the microphone, listen to the instrumental track, and immediately begin vocalizing complex multisyllabic rhyme schemes. The media hailed this as absolute spontaneous genius. In the clinical reality of his chemical subjugation, it was the byproduct of a brain whose executive functioning had been pharmacologically bypassed. He was not actively, consciously composing art. He was opening a valve and allowing a continuous, unedited stream of consciousness to bleed directly into the corporate microphones. The drug isolated him in a euphoric, numbed bubble where the only accessible reality was the rhythm of the beat and the sound of his own voice. He was operating in a state of chemical hypnosis, a biological machine calibrated to convert audio frequencies into marketable intellectual property without the burdensome interference of physical fatigue or emotional reflection. The executive hierarchy of Cash Money Records and the broader distribution syndicates recognized the immense financial utility of this chemically induced mania. The mid-2000s marked a critical transition in the music industry's economic model. The digital era was emerging, and the localized mixtape circuit was expanding into a global online distribution network. In this new, hyper-competitive digital landscape, the traditional model of releasing one carefully crafted album every 2 years was no longer sufficient to maintain absolute market dominance. The new algorithm demanded volume. It required an overwhelming, continuous flood of content to suffocate competitors and monopolize consumer attention. To conquer this market, a label did not just need a talented artist. They required an industrial content generator. Dwayne Carter, heavily sedated and permanently stationed in the vocal booth, was the perfect proprietary hardware for this new economic reality. The label executives did not intervene to break the cycle of his addiction, nor did they implement standard human resources protocols to limit his working hours and protect his physical health. Instead, they actively weaponized his pathology. They ensured the recording equipment was always active. They ensured the studio engineers were working in rotating shifts to keep up with his manic output. And most critically, they ensured the localized supply of pharmaceutical-grade cough syrup was never interrupted. They built a highly efficient, climate-controlled extraction facility around his addiction. From a purely corporate perspective, the extraction protocol was a flawless success. Carter released a staggering, almost incomprehensible volume of material. He flooded the internet with the Da Drought and Dedication mixtape series, alongside his massive platinum-selling Thaw Carter studio albums. He became the most ubiquitous, inescapable voice in global commercial music. He was generating millions of dollars in untaxed liquid capital, merchandise revenue, and digital streaming dividends. But the hidden cost of this unprecedented market saturation was the systematic, rapid degradation of the biological host. The tragedy of this specific phase in Carter's operational timeline is deeply rooted in his own psychological defense mechanisms. The industry had successfully conditioned him to equate his chemical dependency with his professional identity. Because the drugs allowed him to bypass physical exhaustion and record at an unnatural pace, he genuinely believed the chemicals were the source of his superpower. He internalized the destructive corporate narrative that his relentless, drug-fueled output was proof of his superiority over his peers. He boasted in his lyrical content about his lack of sleep, his constant consumption of syrup, and his status as a non-human entity, frequently referring to himself as an alien or a Martian. This was not merely a clever marketing gimmick. It was the terrifying, genuine psychological reality of a man who no longer recognized his own humanity. He felt alien because he was no longer functioning as a human being. He had been reduced to a highly specialized, chemically lubricated component within a massive financial engine. The young boy from Hollygrove, who had originally utilized his linguistic talent as a desperate escape vector from poverty, had simply traded the kinetic violence of the physical streets for the sterile, invisible violence of the corporate recording studio. He was a multimillionaire, yet he was effectively a captive. He was a hostage to the expectations of his fan base, a hostage to the massive financial overhead of his label, and ultimately, a hostage to the purple liquid that kept the entire terrifying illusion from collapsing. The fans consumed the music, the critics debated his lyrical dexterity, and the corporate executives tallied their massive quarterly bonuses, all while actively ignoring the physical reality of the asset. They were listening to a human being slowly neurologically drowning in real time, completely isolated in a soundproof room, confusing the frantic panic thrashing of his own drowning with the passionate strokes of a master swimmer. The machine required fuel, the machine required output, and the machine fundamentally did not care that the gears were grinding themselves into toxic, irreversible dust. The continuous, uninterrupted saturation of the central nervous system with high-grade liquid opiates does not merely suppress physical exhaustion, it systematically dismantles the brain's executive functioning. In the forensic evaluation of Dwayne Carter's mid-career operational timeline, we must analyze the catastrophic secondary effects of his chemical dependency. When a biological host consumes massive daily quantities of codeine and promethazine, the prefrontal cortex, the SPI, fixed sector of the brain responsible for impulse control, critical decision-making, and long-term consequence evaluation, is fundamentally paralyzed. The host is reduced to a state of absolute baseline impulsivity. For Carter, this neurological degradation did not just manifest in the recording booth. It violently spilled over into his interpersonal operations and his physical lifestyle, transforming him into a highly erratic, severely disoriented entity completely untethered from standard social and financial reality. The most glaring physically documented evidence of this total loss of executive control was his absolute abandonment of biological and sexual discipline. The global media and the rap industry syndicate eagerly framed his lifestyle as the ultimate manifestation of rockstar excess, celebrating his status as a wealthy, untouchable player. But forensic behavioral analysis strips away this glamorous facade to reveal a deeply disturbing pattern of herd-like, unregulated sexuality driven entirely by chemical disorientation. In a highly compressed, chaotic operational window, Carter biologically generated 4 offspring with 4 separate female partners. This was not the strategic, calculated behavior of a traditional industry playboy operating from a position of power. It was the frantic, unguarded biological output of a severely addicted man operating without any functional neurological safety protocols. He was navigating the world in a perpetual, heavily sedated fog, incapable of evaluating the long-term consequences of his physical actions. This total biological recklessness instantly created a massive, inescapable logistical and financial nightmare. By fathering multiple children across multiple disconnected households, Carter unintentionally engineered a highly toxic, multi-tiered pressure system around his own neck. He was no longer just an artist required to generate revenue for his record label. He was suddenly transformed into the central, bleedy, node of a massive, highly parasitic financial network. He was legally and socially mandated to sustain the luxurious, high-overhead lifestyles of 4 different women, their children, a sprawling entourage of neighborhood associates from New Orleans, and the vast blood-sucking apparatus of his management team. The financial burn rate of this ecosystem was astronomical, mathematical insanity. He was funding multiple mansions, fleets of luxury vehicles, private aviation logistics, and the continuous exorbitant supply of illegal narcotics required to keep his own brain functioning. This crushing, multifaceted financial obligation created a lethal operational paradox. The very lifestyle that his chemical addiction had blindly created now demanded tens of millions of dollars in liquid capital to maintain, which in turn forced him back into the recording booth to consume more chemicals, to generate more product. He was a multimillionaire who was effectively bankrupt in terms of personal autonomy. He was chained to a treadmill operating at a lethal velocity, forced to sprint continuously just to prevent his massive, localized economy from collapsing in on itself. As the financial pressure intensified and the chemical toxicity in his brain reached critical mass, the mechanical output of the asset, his music, suffered a catastrophic, highly visible structural collapse. The corporate machine and the loyal fan base initially refused to acknowledge the decay, but an objective clinical audit of his audio files during this period reveals a chilling neurological decline. The sophisticated multi-syllabic phonetic geometry, the sharp wit, and the unparalleled linguistic dexterity that had originally defined his rise to absolute power were systematically eroded. The opiate had successfully dissolved the higher functions of his intellect. In place of genius, his brain began to output a crude, repetitive, and deeply pathological fixation on baseline physical gratification. His lyre, content devolved into a sick, highly degraded obsession with explicit, depraved sexuality and bodily fluids. The music was no longer a reflection of a street-smart prodigy navigating the complexities of the world. It was the unfiltered, incoherent rambling of a heavily sedated addict whose worldview had shrunk to the size of a styrofoam cup in a hotel bedroom. His vocal delivery, once sharp and aggressive, morphed into a heavily auto-tuned, chemically slurred croak. He sounded precisely like what he was, a biological machine that was actively rotting from the inside out. Yet the most terrifying aspect of this artistic and physical degradation was the absolute sociopathic indifference of the corporate syndicate that surrounded him. In a standard ethical corporate structure, if a primary revenue generator begins to exhibit clear signs of severe neurological decay, erratic behavior, and plummeting product quality, the executive board immediately intervenes. They deploy crisis management, initiate medical rehabilitation protocols, and temporarily halt production to protect the long-term viability of the asset. But Cash Money Records was not an ethical corporate structure. It was a highly predatory extraction operation. The executives, the managers, and the massive entourage of sycophants observed Carter stumbling through recording studios, slurring his speech and producing objectively degraded audio files. They saw the physical tremors, the glazed eyes, and the absolute loss of spatial awareness. But they did not intervene. They did not confiscate the purple liquid. They did not call for medical assistance. Instead, they actively enabled the decay. They recognized that even a brain-damaged, chemically saturated Lil Wayne still possessed enough residual brand momentum to generate millions of dollars in the short term. The corporate label continued to press the degraded audio files onto compact discs. The marketing teams continued to book him for grueling, high-yield arena tours, and the handlers continued to ensure that his supply of codeine was never interrupted. They observed a man slowly, publicly drowning in a highly toxic chemical bath, and their only operational response was to calculate how many more platinum records they could legally extract from his dying body before his heart finally gave out. The asset was decaying. The lyrics were turning into absolute incoherent garbage. But the cash registers were still ringing, and in the cold, unyielding arithmetic of the hip-hop underworld, that was the only metric that mattered. The systematic neurological degradation of Dwayne Carter was not an invisible, localized tragedy occurring solely within the sterile confines of recording booths or the chaotic sprawl of his multiple mansions. The physical symptoms of his massive, sustained chemical toxicity began to violently breach the corporate perimeter, manifesting in highly public, undeniable, and catastrophic biological failures. The timeline of these events provides a chilling forensic record of a human body pushed to the absolute edge of biological cessation. The initial, highly publicized series of catastrophic systemic failures occurred in October of 2012. As previously detailed, Carter experienced multiple severe kinetic convulsions, grand mal seizures, while aboard a private aircraft, forcing unscheduled emergency landings on 2 consecutive days. The human body possesses a finite, measurable capacity to process and eliminate neurotoxins. When that capacity is continuously, exponentially exceeded by the intake of highly concentrated opiates and promethazine, the central nervous system does not simply degrade. It experiences sudden, violent electrical storms. The brain, struggling to regulate the massive influx of depressive chemicals, misfires catastrophically, resulting in total loss of consciousness and violent involuntary muscular contractions. This is the clinical reality of a seizure induced by extreme caltoxicity. It is not exhaustion. It is the biological engine seizing up and shutting down. However, the response of the corporate syndicate surrounding Carter, specifically his management team and the executive hierarchy of Cash Money Records, was a masterclass in sociopathic crisis management. When a primary revenue generator begins to experience severe, life-threatening neurological events, standard operational protocol dictates immediate, comprehensive medical intervention and a complete cessation of all professional activities. But the music industry underworld operates on a vastly different set of logistical priorities. To acknowledge that their most valuable asset was suffering from end-stage substance dependency would be to admit corporate negligence and risk a massive devaluation of their intellectual property portfolio. Therefore, the syndicate deployed a highly coordinated campaign of public relations sanitation and deliberate misinformation. They issued press releases attributing the seizures to dehydration, migraines, and extreme fatigue resulting from his unparalleled work ethic. They actively, aggressively lied to the global media, his fan base, and potentially even to Carter himself, reinforcing the delusion that his physical collapse was merely a symptom of his dedication to his craft, rather than the inevitable consequence of his massive, unregulated consumption of liquid narcotics. The most damning, irrefutable evidence of this corporate complicity emerged in the immediate aftermath of these medical emergencies. Instead of initiating a mandatory medically supervised rehabilitation protocol, the syndicate simply waited for Carter's biological functions to stabilize sufficiently, and then immediately forced him back onto the assembly line. The tours continued. The recording sessions resumed. The supply of codeine remained uninterrupted. They watched him suffer multiple grand mal seizures. They observed him foaming at the mouth and losing consciousness at 30,000 feet, and their only operational response was to adjust his touring schedule and ensure the medical bills were paid quietly. This terrifying cycle of biological collapse and corporate exploitation reached its absolute critical apex in March of 2013. Carter was discovered completely unresponsive on the floor of his Los Angeles residence by his personal security detail. He had experienced another massive, catastrophic seizure. The emergency medical technicians who responded to the scene recognized the immediate, life-threatening severity of his condition. He was rushed to the intensive care unit, ICU, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, one of the most advanced medical facilities in the world. Upon arrival, his biological status was critical. His central nervous system was almost entirely suppressed. His respiratory rate had plummeted to a lethal level, and his heart rate, the primary metric of biological survival, had slowed to a terrifying 30% of its normal capacity. He was not merely unconscious, he was actively, rapidly dying. The medical personnel were forced to immediately initiate extreme, invasive life-saving protocols. He was physically restrained to the hospital bed to prevent further injury from potential convulsions. He was intubated, with a breathing tube forced down his trachea to mechanically sustain his respiration. The most horrifying, visceral detail of this medical emergency was the immediate, desperate procedure required to purge his system of the massive, lethal volume of neurotoxins. The medical team had to continuously pump his stomach, forcefully extracting the massive quantities of codeine and promethazine that had overwhelmed his digestive and neurological systems. He was lying in a sterile, highly sanitized medical environment, surrounded by the most sophisticated technology available, completely dependent on machines to keep his heart beating and his lungs inflating, while the toxic purple liquid that had fueled his entire corporate empire was physically siphoned out of his body. While Carter lay strapped to a bed in the ICU, teetering on the absolute brink of biological cessation, the corporate syndicate initiated their final, most cynical maneuver. Brian Birdman Williams, the man who had groomed Carter since childhood, the man who had positioned himself as a surrogate father, and the chief executive who had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from the assets' labor, appeared on national television. He looked directly into the cameras of the global media and categorically, forcefully denied that drugs played any role in Carter's catastrophic medical collapse. He perpetuated the lie, maintaining the corporate fiction that the near-fatal event was simply the result of working too hard. This public denial is the absolute definitive proof of the sociopathic nature of the hip-hop corporate machine. It demonstrated with chilling clarity that the syndicate valued the protection of the brand and the continuation of the revenue stream vastly more than the physical survival of the human being who generated that revenue. They were willing to watch him die. They were willing to lie to the world about the cause of his death, and they were completely unwilling to intervene and stop the flow of the very chemicals that were killing him. The biological assets survived the ICU, but the psychological and neurological damage was permanent and irreversible. The massive sustained chemical toxicity, combined with the repeated severe electrical storms of the seizures, fundamentally altered the architecture of his brain. In the years following his near-fatal collapse, Carter began to exhibit profound, highly visible symptoms of severe cognitive impairment. He developed significant, undeniable memory loss. In numerous public interviews and interactions, he was completely unable to recall the lyrics to his own most famous songs. He could not remember the names of the albums he had released, the producers he had worked with, or the specific details of the monumental projects that had defined his career. His vocal delivery, once the sharpest, most agile instrument in the industry, became permanently slurred, erratic, and physically strained. The physical toll was absolute. He had survived the corporate meat grinder, but he emerged as a fundamentally broken entity. He was a multimillionaire, possessing massive wealth, global fame, and an unparalleled legacy, But he was trapped inside a biological vessel that had been systematically, ruthlessly destroyed by the very industry that had enriched him. He was a king sitting on a throne built of platinum records, but he could no longer remember how he got there, or the lyrics that had paid for the crown. The corporate machine had successfully extracted every ounce of profit from his genius, and had left him with nothing but a shattered nervous system and a styrofoam cup that was finally, permanently empty. While the biological infrastructure of Dwayne Carter was actively failing, sustaining catastrophic neurological damage and severe memory erasure, the corporate syndicate surrounding him executed a maneuver of such profound calculated cruelty that it redefined the parameters of industry exploitation. The physical deterioration of the asset was no longer a secret. The seizures, the hospitalizations, and the slurred, incoherent public appearances had thoroughly breached the public relations containment protocols. In a standard ethical business model, an asset in this state of critical degradation would be decommissioned, medically rehabilitated, and financially secured for their past contributions. However, Brian Birdman Williams and the executive board of Cash Money Records did not operate an ethical business. They operated a localized cartel. And when they realized the primary revenue engine was finally inevitably breaking down, their response was not to offer medical salvation, but to initiate a massive systematic financial freeze. Between 2014 and 2015, the psychological slaughterhouse transitioned from the recording booth to the courtroom. Dwayne Carter, having sacrificed his central nervous system, his internal organs, and his developmental years to build the Cash Money empire, formally requested the release of his highly anticipated, theoretically final masterpiece, the Carter 5. He also demanded the tens of millions of dollars in mechanical royalties, advances, and publishing dividends he was contractually owed. The response from the man he had publicly called his father since the age of 12 was a cold, absolute embargo. Birdman unilaterally refused to release the album and refused to distribute the capital. He effectively locked Carter in a financial and contractual cryogenic chamber. The biological asset was suddenly rendered a corporate hostage. He could not legally release new music to generate external capital, and he was completely blocked from accessing the massive wealth he had already generated. The $50 million lawsuit Carter was forced to file against his own surrogate father stands as the ultimate chilling indictment of the hip-hop corporate structure. It exposed the core, parasitic architecture of the industry. The executives will happily groom a child, feed him liquid opiates to force him to work impossibly long hours and extract hundreds of millions from his labor. But the moment the artist attempts to claim his own autonomy, the syndicate will starve him out. They observed a physically compromised, chemically dependent man, and they ruthlessly weaponized the legal system to trap him. The psychological weight of this specific betrayal cannot be overstated in forensic behavioral analysis. For Carter, Cash Money Records was not just a distributor, it was his sole foundational reality. Birdman was the only paternal authority figure he had ever known. The realization that this entire relationship, spanning 2 decades, was nothing more than a predatory extraction protocol, that his father viewed him entirely as disposable proprietary hardware, triggered a catastrophic, highly predictable biological response. Deprived of his art, stripped of his financial autonomy, and psychologically shattered by the ultimate betrayal, Carter inevitably returned to the only coping mechanism the industry had ever taught him to utilize. he returned to the chemical shock absorber. The operational timeline confirms the relapse with brutal kinetic efficiency. In June of 2016, the exact same mechanical failure repeated itself. Carter boarded a private jet traveling from Milwaukee to California. Mid-flight, the central nervous system violently short-circuited once again. The aircraft was forced to execute an emergency landing in Omaha, Nebraska. Paramedics breached the cabin to find the multi-platinum artist actively seizing, his brain entirely overwhelmed by a fresh wave of chemical toxicity. He had learned nothing, and the corporate machine surrounding him had changed nothing. The cycle of severe emotional trauma, followed by massive chemical suppression, followed by catastrophic biological failure, was an unbreakable, closed-loop system. The industry had hardwired him to self-destruct whenever the pressure exceeded baseline parameters. Today, when an independent forensic investigator audits the current physical and operational manifestation of Lil Wayne, they are presented with a walking, breathing paradox. He steps onto stages as a living ghost, a biological husk propped up by the residual momentum of his past corporate glory. Visually, his mouth is encased in $200,000 worth of surgically implanted diamonds, projecting the ultimate glittering symbol of hip-hop opulence and absolute financial victory. Yet the physical vessel supporting that diamond smile is horrifyingly degraded. The skin is severely prematurely aged, sagging with the heavy, undeniable toll of a man who has Cali audited his own cellular structure for 20 years. The eyes are frequently hollow, disconnected, and vacant, staring out at a world through a thick, permanent neurological fog. The live performance data provides the most tragic metric of his decay. Consumers continue to pay premium prices, expecting to witness the razor-sharp, hyper-agile linguistic titan of 2008. Instead, they are presented with a glitching, failing biological machine. The vocal output, once the most dominant frequency in global commercial music, has deteriorated into a strained, off-pitch, and entirely erratic squeak. His timing is completely shattered. He frequently forgets his own lyrics, wandering the stage in a state of visible confusion. There are widely documented, highly publicized instances where the live audience, suddenly realizing they are not watching a concert, but rather the tragic live-action decay of a former genius, simply turn around and walk out in the middle of the performance. The proprietary hardware is fundamentally irreparably defective, yet the industry and the touring syndicates continue to prop it up under the stage lights, squeezing the last desperate drops of nostalgia revenue out of a desiccated entity. The absolute terrifying finality of this case study lies in the complete erasure of his own internal hard drive. The massive wealth, the sprawling estates, and the fleet of luxury vehicles cannot purchase a replacement for a dissolved prefrontal cortex. In recent highly disturbing interviews, Carter has openly admitted, with a chilling lack of emotional comprehension, that he possesses almost no memory of his own legendary discography. When interviewers reference Thaw Carter III, an album that shifted the global cultural axis and sold 1 million copies in a single week, he stares blankly. He does not remember writing the songs. He does not remember the studio sessions. The chemical solvent he consumed to survive the grueling corporate assembly line successfully numbed his physical exhaustion, but it also systematically wiped his neurological hard drive clean. This is the final unedited legacy of Dwayne Michael Carter Jr. and the ultimate bloody indictment of the American music industry's meat grinder. The executives took a hungry, brilliant 12-year-old child from the violent streets of Hollygrove. They chained him to a microphone, hooked him up to a continuous intravenous drip of liquid opiates to artificially overclock his brain, and extracted $1 billion in global revenue from his manic drug-fueled hyperproductivity. They marketed his slow, agonizing public suicide as a trendy lifestyle brand, successfully convincing a generation of children that the styrofoam cup was a symbol of success rather than a chemical straitjacket. Dwayne Carter survived the seizures, the ICU, and the corporate betrayals, and he ultimately secured his financial victory. But the cost of that victory was absolute. He traded his neurological integrity for a spot on the Forbes list. He is alive, but the unparalleled genius that defined his existence was forcefully flushed out of his system through an intensive care unit, stomach pump, left entirely forgotten in the sterile biohazard bins of a Los Angeles hospital. He beat the poverty of Hollygrove, but he could not beat the ruthless, parasitic mathematics of the hip-hop corporate machine. He was chewed up, completely stripped of his memories, and spat out as a wealthy, diamond-encrusted shell.